Okay, so moving files from Revit to the 3D printer is pretty simple. It's a little bit steppy, but we're essentially going to use 3ds Max as sort of our portal to push these files through and export them as stereolithography files and get them into our 3D printing software, which is called MakerWare. So here's the MakerWare program. Essentially, that's a virtual build space that is going to match what we can build with the Rep2. So inside of Revit, first step that I'm going to do is select the object or objects that I want to print, and I'm going to isolate them. So I've got objects selected. I'm going to go to temporary hide and isolate and say isolate element. That gets me only those objects left. And I'm going to then say big R, export, FBX. And this was the best format to bring things from Revit into 3ds Max unless I want to link them. We'll just call that object 1. And I'm going to say leave temporary hide and isolate on because I don't want anything else to go, just those objects. That's all I'm looking for. Inside of 3ds Max, I'm going to go to the big M, import. I believe I called that FBX object 1. Open. OK, and OK. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my sunlight, my camera, and I'm going to do a zoom extents. Now, in Revit, I was working at 1:1. These are small little objects. So I don't really need to do any scaling or anything like that. But one of the reasons why I like to use 3D Studio Max is, unlike Revit, if I turn on the scale tool, I can really quickly, say, drop something down to half its size by putting in those numerical values into that box, so that's become half its size. Of course, it's scaled at about its axis, which is not centered on the object, which is why they went off screen. But that is a really, really helpful way to be able to manipulate things in a way that Revit can't, in terms of bringing that scale down. And you can get into, if I'm going to print something out at an 1/8 inch or a 16th inch, you can get into putting a very precise value into this to move from a 1:1 model, something that is 40 feet long, that obviously our printer, which prints about 6 inches by 6 inches by 12 inches, is not going to do. But we can drop that down to an 1/8 inch and then have something that's going to fit on the print bed and also be to an exact architectural scale. So that's sort of why I send things through 3ds Max. You can do the scaling inside of MakerWare as well, but the process in Max for me is just run a little bit smoother, and I can check things, I can measure things again in 3D Studio Max and make sure that I'm keeping things correctly, because math to me can be confusing. So big M, export, and I'm going to export a stereolithography file. Call it object 1. Notice selected only. My file is selected or my object is selected. You use this if you have multiple objects in your scene. You can export them sort of one at a time. That's why selected only is your default. But if it gives you an error message, nothing was selected, it's probably because you're trying to export without your object selected itself. So make sure your object is selected. So I'm going to say OK. And then I'm going to go to MakerWare and say add to the build platform, and object 1 STL file, and I'm going to say keep the size of the object, but I do want to move it to the platform. So that gives me those little bitty guy. And again, the base code, in terms of numerically speaking, the base code inside of MakerWare is 1 is going to equal a millimeter. Inside of 3D Studio Max, 1 is going to be an inch. So we've got a little tool right here for that, inches to millimeters, and that gets my objects now ready to print. So those are the actual size of the objects and how they relate on the build platform. So the next step that I'm ready to do is just hit make. Typically we want to use the standard resolution in printing. You can see the primary thing that's going to change. If I go to low, I've got a 0.3 millimeter layer height, so each vertical slice is 0.3 millimeters. The standard is 0.2. High, I rarely use high, but it drops down to 0.1. Standard should be perfectly fine for that. Most objects, I've had the best luck with a raft, but if the object itself has a really good base to it, a really simple base to it like these do, I would typically try printing those without the raft first. It's just going to save about 10-15 minutes of printing and quite a bit of the filament as well. So I'm going to turn off raft. There's nothing here that needs supports either. There's no major overhangs or anything like that that would require supports. So I'm on standard, no rafts, no support, and I'm just going to hit the export button, and this is going to give me the X3G file to print. If I am at the computer that's hooked to the Rep2, you're simply going to use make it now rather than export. But once I run that export routine, object 1, it's going to build those slicing profiles really quickly. And I do want to show one more quick thing. So this is actually going to give me the X3G file. I also want to look at the preview file as well once it's done building the slicing profile, because the preview file has some important information. So I'm back under the Make tool again. I'm going to turn on Preview and Export. And this is going to give what it is going to print. So this is giving me the amount of material that it's going to use, 17 grams. And then it's also going to show me exactly how this is being built layer by layer, which is really convenient to see. So you can understand from layer 1, that's the base layer that's being printed down, and then each layer up, how it's going to handle the different slopes, how the resolution is going to work. You can actually begin to see millimeter layers as they go up vertically. And then that gives you both the amount of material being used and the time that it's going to take to print those two particular pieces.